The chair scraped back so hard it hit the wall. Walter Pruitt, 78 years old, hands shaking, eyes wet, pushed himself to his feet and brought his right hand to his temple in a slow, deliberate salute. The room went silent, not quiet, silent, the kind that fills your ears like water. Derek's coffee cup hit the floor. Melissa grabbed the edge of the table. The inheritance lawyer stopped mid-sentence, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, staring at me like he'd just realized the document in his hands was something far heavier than paper. I didn't smile. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't triumphant. I was just tired. The good kind of tired. The kind that means something is finally over. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. It always means the world to me to know who's out there. Now, let me take you back to where this really started. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I sat in the parking lot of a Holiday Inn off Route 11, engine running, hands on the wheel staring at the address on my phone. Clarksville, Tennessee. The town I hadn't set foot in since the night I turned 18, threw a duffel bag into a Greyhound bus and told myself I was never coming back. I'd kept that promise for 22 years. The text from the law office had come 3 weeks before. Formal letterhead, clean language. The estate of Thomas Allen Cox is scheduled for reading on October 14th. As a named party, your presence is requested. That was all. No explanation. No apology for the 14 months of silence after my father died. No acknowledgement that no one had called me when it happened. Not one of them, not Derek, not Melissa, not Sandra. I found out because a former colleague, a JAG attorney I'd worked a case with in Kabul, saw the obituary online and forwarded it to my Army email with a single line. "Isn't this your dad?" I was in Fort Bragg when I read it. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I had a briefing at 0700, and I sat outside the conference room for 11 minutes before I could make my face neutral enough to walk in. That was 14 months ago. At 47, I had stopped expecting anything to be fair. That is not pessimism. That is just what happens after enough years. You learn to measure the world not by what it owes you, but by what you can still do with what's left. 22 years in the United States Army teaches you that lesson in ways that have nothing to do with classrooms. I served. I fought cases no one else wanted. I prosecuted war crimes, defended soldiers wrongly accused, stood in courts martial in countries whose names most Americans can't find on a map. I built a life out of service and silence, and the particular discipline of people who have learned that their feelings are not the most important thing in any given room. My father knew that about me. He was proud of it, in the awkward, fumbling way of men who don't know how to say proud out loud. He'd write letters, real ones, on paper, in his slanted left-handed cursive, and I would write back. For years, we had that. A quiet correspondence between two people who loved each other from a careful distance, because the house he lived in had Sandra in it, and Sandra had never wanted me there. She made that clear the first year after my parents' divorce. I was 9. She moved in when I was 11. By the time I was 15, I understood the geometry of that house. There was space for her children, and there was space for my father, and those two spaces were expanding. The space for me was not. Derek was Sandra's oldest, 17 when she married my father. Big, loud, comfortable in his own skin the way people are when they've never been made to feel like a problem. He called me the leftover once at the dinner table, and Sandra laughed. My father looked at his plate. That was the moment I understood something important. Love is not always enough to make someone choose you, and I decided very quietly that I would never build my life around waiting to be chosen. So I didn't. I studied. I ran. I tested into ROTC at the University of Tennessee on a full scholarship. I graduated, commissioned, deployed, advanced. I became Lieutenant Colonel Kylie Cox, JAG Corps, with a record that would make a certain kind of man deeply uncomfortable if he ever bothered to look it up. None of them ever bothered to Sandra's family. And that's what they were. Sandra's family living in my father's house. I was just the daughter who disappeared, the one who didn't come home for Christmas, the difficult one, the one with the attitude. The one Thomas kept writing letters to, which Sandra never liked and never said so directly, but made felt in 100 small ways. I found out later she'd intercepted some of those letters. I don't know how many. I never asked. Some things, once you know the shape of them, you don't need every detail. The morning of October 14th, I drove from Nashville, where I'd flown in the night before. I wore civilian clothes, gray slacks, a dark blouse, a jacket. Nothing that announced anything. I do that by habit now. The kind of habit the Army builds into you when you've spent years in environments where being underestimated is tactically useful. The law office was on Pemberton Lane, a cream-colored building with black shutters and a small brass plate by the door. Hargrove and Associates, Estate Law. I sat in my rental car for 9 minutes. I know it was 9 because I watched the clock. I thought about my father. Not the old man in the obituary photo, the one with the thin white hair and the tired eyes, but the one I remembered from before, the one who taught me to fish at the creek behind the house. The one who read to me from a World War II history book when I was 8, tracing the maps with his finger, telling me that ordinary people do extraordinary things when they decide something matters enough. He was the reason I joined, not because he told me to. Because watching him navigate a life where he consistently chose peace over truth, accommodation over justice, watching that cost him, taught me what I did not want to become. I wanted to be the person who could stand in a hard room and hold the line. 22 years later, I had done that in places that would give most people nightmares. And here I was, scared to walk into a law office in Clarksville, Tennessee. I got out of the car. I smoothed my jacket. I squared my shoulders, not dramatically, just the micro-adjustment that 22 years of military bearing makes us automatic. The kind of thing you don't notice until someone points it out. I pushed open the door. The receptionist looked up. She was young, early 20s, and she gave me the polite professional smile of someone doing their job. I gave her my name. She glanced at her list. Something shifted in her expression, just slightly. Just for a second, like she recognized it, like that name meant something to her that she hadn't expected. She said, "They're already in the conference room, Miss Cox." Down the hall, second door on the left, I walked down that hall, and before I even reached the door, I could hear Derek's voice on the other side, loud and certain and completely at ease, the way he had always been, a man who had never once in his life walked into a room wondering if he belonged there. I put my hand on the door handle. I thought of Afghanistan. I thought of the first time I walked into a general's tent to prosecute a case that 3 senior officers had told me to drop. I thought, I have been in harder rooms than this. I opened the door. The conference room smelled like old wood and fresh coffee. It was a long, narrow room with a mahogany table that seated 12. Heavy curtains, half drawn. An American flag in the corner, the kind that stands in every formal room in this part of the country, so familiar it becomes invisible. A portrait of some founding partner on the wall, stern and permanent. They were all there. Derek sat at the far end of the table, the power seat, the one closest to where the lawyer would stand. He was heavier than I remembered. 52 now, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who fills a room by volume. He wore a blazer over a collared shirt, no tie, the specific combination of a man who wants to look serious without appearing to try. His wife, Carol, sat beside him, thin and watchful, her hands folded on the table like she was already in church. Melissa was to Derek's left, 49, my age almost to the year, though we had never once felt like peers. She had Sandra's coloring, pale and sharp, and Sandra's habit of looking at people like she was calculating something. She glanced up when I entered, a single flat look, then back to her phone. Sandra herself was at the side of the table, not at the head. That surprised me, briefly. Then I understood. Derek had taken the head. Even in his stepfather's inheritance meeting, Derek had taken the head. Sandra was 74 now. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had spent so many years constructing her in memory as a large and formidable presence that the actual woman couldn't compete with the architecture. She wore black, which was either grief or strategy. with Sandra. It was always hard to know there were two other people I didn't recognize. A younger man I assumed was Derek's son, and a woman about 30 who might have been Melissa's daughter. The next generation, already inheriting their parents' certainty that this room belonged to them. And then there was me. I took a seat on the near side of the table, close to the door, which was habit. In any room where I didn't know the exits, I found them first. I set my bag on the floor, folded my hands, and looked at no one in particular. Derek noticed. Of course he noticed. Derek always noticed when he wasn't being looked at. He said, "You actually showed up." Not a question. Not a greeting. Just a statement delivered with a particular kind of satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who expected a thing and got it, and is already deciding what to do next. I said, "I was named in the notice." He smiled. The smile of a man who has already won, and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. "Yeah, well, Dad named a lot of people in a lot of things over the years. Didn't always mean much in the end." Carol touched his arm, not to stop him. Just the reflexive gesture of a woman who has learned to look like she's managing him. Melissa didn't look up from her phone. Sandra looked at me. A long look. Something in it I couldn't quite read. Not guilt. Exactly, but the cousin of guilt. The expression of someone who has told themselves a story about what they did for so long that they've mostly stopped seeing it clearly. I looked back at her. Neither of us spoke. The lawyer, a trim man in his 60s named Hargrove, wire glasses, careful movements, came in a few minutes later and began arranging documents on the table with the precise, unhurried manner of a man who has conducted many of these proceedings and knows that grief and money together create a specific kind of pressure that must be managed quietly. He thanked everyone for coming. He explained the process. He noted that the estate of Thomas Cox included real property, liquid assets, and certain personal effects, and that the reading today would establish the distribution as specified in the valid testamentary documents. Derek said, "Let's just get to it, Warren." He called the lawyer Warren. First name. The ease of a man who had already had this conversation privately, in a different room at a different time. Hargrove said, mildly, "We're waiting on one more party." Derek frowned. "Everyone's here." Not quite. A silence. Derek looked around the table. His eyes landed on me and moved past. Then came back. "She's here," he said flatly. "She doesn't count as—" "We're waiting on someone else," Hargrove said. The mildness had a bottom to it now. The firmness of a man who has been doing this long enough to know when to stop accommodating. And then the door opened. He was tall for his age, or had been once, now slightly curved forward by years, the way old soldiers sometimes carry themselves, like the weight of what they've seen has settled permanently across the shoulders. White-haired, deliberate in his movements. He wore a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap, faded blue, with pins across the brim, Walter Pruitt. I hadn't seen him since I was maybe 15. He had lived 2 properties down from us, an older man even then, a widower who kept a vegetable garden and occasionally came over for Sunday dinners when my father was in a good stretch. He and my father had served in different eras. Walter in Vietnam. My father briefly in the early 80s. But they had that thing between them that veterans have, a shorthand built on shared understanding of something most people never touched. He came in slowly. He found a chair against the wall, away from the table, and sat down with the careful economy of a man managing pain he's not going to mention. He didn't look at Derek. He looked at me for just a moment. A long, quiet look that held something in it I hadn't expected. Recognition. But not just that, pride. Like he had been waiting. Derek said, "Who is that?" Hargrove said, "Mr. Pruitt is here as a witness to certain documents." He was personally requested by Thomas Cox to be present at the reading. My father didn't. "Your stepfather," Hargrove said, still mild, still precise, made several arrangements in the final months of his life. Some of those arrangements included Mr. Pruitt. I'll explain the relevance when we reach that portion of the reading. Derek sat back. The smile was gone now. Something else had moved in under it, something careful and watchful, the expression of a man recalculating. Melissa put her phone down. Sandra's hands, I noticed, were no longer still. She had them pressed flat against the table, fingers spread, the way people do when they need to feel something solid underneath them. Hargrove straightened his papers. He cleared his throat. He said, "Shall we begin?" No one answered. No one needed to. The room had already changed. Hargrove began with the formalities. The legal language of estate proceedings has a particular rhythm. Measured, deliberate, designed to create the impression that everything happening in this room has been anticipated, documented, and will proceed in an orderly fashion regardless of how anyone feels about it. I knew that rhythm well. 22 years in JAG meant I had sat in rooms like this more times than I could count, usually on the other side of the table, usually holding the documents that were about to change someone's life. It was strange to be on this side. Hargrove confirmed the date of death, August 19th of the previous year. He confirmed the property holdings. He named the accounts. He laid out the shape of what Thomas Cox had spent his life accumulating. The farmhouse on Route 7 and its 11 acres, the secondary parcel adjacent to it, a brokerage account, a savings account, personal property, including vehicles and equipment. The total, when Hargrove read the appraised value, landed in the room with a weight I don't think any of us had fully anticipated. $2.3 million. I watched Derek's face when the number was read. The careful neutrality of a man who already knew the figure and was performing surprise for the room's benefit. The performance was not convincing, at least not to me. I had spent too many years watching people manage their reactions under pressure to miss the tells, the micro-tightening around the eyes, the breath held a half-second too long, the way he settled back into his chair with the precise body language of a man settling into what he already considers his. He had been here before. Not in this room, maybe, but in this conversation. Someone had told him what to expect. I filed that away. Melissa was watching me now. She had picked up her phone again, but wasn't looking at it. The screen was dark, just something to hold. Her eyes moved to me every few seconds with the regularity of someone monitoring a variable they're not sure about. I kept my face neutral. Military bearing is not coldness. People confuse the two. It is simply the practiced ability to allow the outside of you to remain steady while the inside does whatever it needs to do. In Afghanistan, I had cross-examined witnesses in 110-degree heat in a room without air conditioning, with a general outside the door who had already decided the outcome. I had kept my face neutral then. I could keep it neutral now. Sandra had not looked at me since Hargrove started reading. She was looking at the table, or at Hargrove, or at some middle distance that existed between her and the wall. Her hands were still pressed flat. She had aged in the way of women who have spent a great deal of their lives managing things. A particular kind of tired that settles in around the eyes and doesn't fully leave. I had no interest in being cruel to Sandra. That might surprise people. It surprised me a little, if I'm honest. I had spent enough years being angry at her, a clean, controlled anger that I kept in a specific compartment and didn't let bleed into anything else, that I had expected to feel it more sharply when I saw her again. But the woman sitting across the room from me looked less like the adversary of my memory, and more like someone who had made decisions decades ago that were now arriving to settle their account. That is not something I needed to accelerate. It had its own momentum. Derek was the one who needed managing. He started in during the 10-minute break Hargrove called midway through the preliminary documentation. Just a break for water, for the room to breathe. The moment Hargrove stepped out, Derek stood and came around the table. Not aggressive, controlled. The walk of a man who considers proximity a tool. He stopped at the corner nearest to me and said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I don't know what you think is going to happen. Today." I looked up at him. "I think Hargrove is going to read the documents. There's a process here. There's an understanding that was in place before you showed up with your government job and your..." He stopped, searched for the word. "Your attitude," I said. "I don't have an attitude, Derek." "I came because I was named in the notice. You were named as a courtesy." Dad always felt guilty about you. That's what this is. That's the only reason you're in this room. A guilt entry in a document that means nothing. I looked at him for a moment. He was close enough that I could see the particular quality of certainty in his eyes. The deep, settled certainty of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility that he might be wrong about something fundamental. I said, "Okay, just that." He waited for more. There wasn't more. I turned back toward Hargrove's chair at the head of the table and folded my hands in my lap. Derek stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he went back to his seat. From across the room, I felt Walter Pruitt's eyes on the back of my neck. I didn't turn, but I felt it. The specific quality of an old soldier watching a younger one hold a position. Approving. Patient, like he knew exactly how this was going to go. Hargrove came back in. He set a fresh folder on the table. A different folder, I noticed that. Thicker. A different color tab than the one he'd been working from before. He sat down. He adjusted his glasses. He said, "Before we continue with the standard distribution, there are several documents I need to introduce into the record. The first is a DNA analysis report commissioned by Thomas Cox himself, completed 8 weeks before his death." He paused. "The second is an amendment to the primary will, executed under military notarizations and submitted through official JAG channels." The room went still. Derek said, "What?" Hargrove looked at him over the rim of his glasses, the mild, bottomless look of a man who has seen exactly this reaction before and is entirely unmoved by it. "The second," Hargrove said, "is an amendment to the primary will. There's no amendment. You reviewed the document filed with this office in August of last year," Hargrove said. "Yes. However, a second document was submitted through a different channel, executed under military notarization, which under Tennessee law carries equal standing. It arrived sealed, with proper chain of custody documentation." He laid his hand on the thick folder. "It was submitted on behalf of the testator, and it supersedes silence." Sandra made a sound, small, almost nothing, like air leaving a room through a crack in the wall. Derek stared at the folder. Hargrove opened it and began to read. The first thing Hargrove read was a name, not mine, not yet. He began with the preamble, the legal architecture that frames a will, the language that establishes identity, intent, soundness of mind, the formal declaration that this document represents the true and considered wishes of the person who made it. I had written that language myself, for other people, in other circumstances. I knew every clause of it. I knew what it was doing. It was building a foundation that could not be moved, Thomas S. Allen Cox. It said, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, having sought independent counsel and submitted to DNA analysis voluntarily and without coercion, hereby amends and supersedes all prior testamentary documents. Derek's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth. Hargrove raised one hand, a small, precise gesture without looking up from the page. Derek closed his mouth. Hargrove continued. The DNA analysis, he explained, had been conducted by a certified laboratory in Nashville. Samples had been provided by Thomas Cox and by 3 of his children. The word children landed in the room with a particular weight for the purpose of establishing biological relationship. The results, submitted as Exhibit A and authenticated by chain of custody documentation, were clear. Hargrove set the preliminary page aside and lifted the next sheet. He read it the way you read something that matters, slowly, without editorial. Thomas Allen Cox shares biological paternity with one named individual. He looked up, Kylie Cox. The room didn't move. Then Hargrove said, "No biological paternity relationship was identified between Thomas Allen Cox and Derek James Sutton, Melissa Ann Sutton, or Ryan Patrick Sutton, their father's name. Their real father's name, from Sandra's first marriage, the one before Thomas. I had always known, somewhere in the architecture of things, that the math didn't quite work, the timing of Sandra's marriage to Thomas, the ages of her children. I had known it the way you know things you've decided not to investigate, because the knowing won't change anything that matters. Thomas had known it too, for years probably. And he had chosen to raise them anyway, which was the most Thomas thing imaginable. A man so constitutionally committed to peace and accommodation that he had built a family around a truth he never said out loud. Until now, until this room. Until this folder that he had arranged, through channels I didn't know about, to arrive here after he was gone and could no longer be pressured into silence. I felt something move through me. Not triumph, not vindication. Something older than that. The particular grief of understanding a person more clearly than you did when they were alive, seeing the full shape of who they were, including the parts they couldn't show you while they were in it. He had done what he could. It just took him until the end to do it, Melissa said, very quietly. That's not possible, Hargrove said. The documentation has been independently verified. I can provide the lab contact for any party wishing to conduct independent analysis. That's not. Melissa stopped. Her voice had lost its shape. Mom, she turned to Sandra. Mom, tell him that's not. Sandra said nothing. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her face had gone to a place I recognized, the place people go when the story they've been telling themselves for 30 years is no longer available. It is not the face of guilt, exactly. It is something more structural. The face of someone whose entire internal architecture has just been informed that the foundation is not what they thought. She said nothing, and her silence was its own kind of answer. Derek had not moved. He was sitting with a stillness that was different from composure. It was the stillness of a man whose processing speed had been exceeded. I had seen it before, in interrogations, in courts martial. The moment when the prepared response becomes unavailable because the situation has moved outside the territory the person had mapped. He was staring at the folder. Then he looked at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With something more basic than that, he was recalculating. And that was the moment Walter Pruitt stood up. He rose from his chair against the wall with the slow, deliberate effort of a man managing a body that has been through things. He straightened. And then he brought his right hand to his temple in a crisp, precise military salute, directed at me. No one in the room had any framework for it. I watched it move through them. Confusion first, then something else. A dawning recalibration, as they tried to understand what gesture from a 78-year-old veteran could possibly mean in the context of an estate reading. Hargrove had stopped reading. I held Walter's eyes for a moment. His were steady and clear, the eyes of a man who has decided something and is at peace with the decision. I said quietly, "At ease, Walter." The words came out of me automatically, the reflex of 22 years. The reflex of a person who has been in command of things and has never quite stopped being. Carol, Derek's wife, said, "I'm sorry, what?" Hargrove removed his glasses and set them on the table. He looked at the room, at Derek, at Melissa, at Sandra, who still had not moved. He said, "Perhaps this is a good moment to provide some additional context." He reached for a separate document. Among the materials submitted with the amended will is a letter from Thomas Cox, addressed to this office, requesting that the following information be read into the record. He unfolded it. I will quote directly, he read. "My daughter Kylie has spent 22 years serving this country in ways I was not always able to acknowledge while I was alive. I was not always brave enough to say what needed to be said in the time I had. I am trying to correct that now. I am asking Warren Hargrove to read this into the record because I want there to be a room, at least one room, where the truth about my daughter is spoken out loud." Hargrove's voice did not waver. He had done this before, sat in rooms and read the words of people who were no longer there to say them. He understood the weight of the assignment. She is Lieutenant Colonel Kylie Cox, United States Army, Judge Advocate General's Corps. She has served with more courage and more integrity than anyone in this family has given her credit for, including me. Whatever she receives from my estate, she has earned 100 times over, in ways that have nothing to do with money. He set the letter down. The room was absolutely still. Walter lowered his hand. He sat back down, slowly, and folded his hands in his lap. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. Derek said, "You're a..." He couldn't finish the sentence. I looked at him. For just a moment, I let him see it. Not cruelty, not satisfaction. Just the plain, unadorned fact of who I was, who I had always been. The person he had looked at for 30 years and decided didn't count. Then I looked back at Hargrove. I said, "Please continue." People always want the war stories to be clean. They want them to have a beginning and a middle and an end, with a clear line between the right side and the wrong side, and a moment at the finish where the good thing wins and stays one. That is not how any of it works. Anyone who has been there will tell you the same thing, and if they tell you different, they are selling you something. I joined the Army at 22. I commissioned as a second lieutenant, went through JAG school at the University of Virginia, and received my first assignment at Fort Hood, Texas, where I learned very quickly that military law is not a clean thing practiced in clean rooms by clean people. It is the law of human beings under extreme pressure, which means it contains all the same ugliness and complexity and moral ambiguity as any other law, plus guns, plus the specific distortions that come from hierarchy and fear and the weight of life and death decisions made in seconds. I was good at it from the start, not because I was brilliant. I was competent, which is different and more durable, but because I had spent my entire childhood learning to read a room where the power was not distributed in my favor, and to find the argument that the room could not dismiss. That is a specific skill. Not everyone has it. I had been training for it since I was 9 years old, sitting at a dinner table where I was the variable no one had accounted for. My first deployment was Iraq, 2003. I was 28 years old, and I flew into Baghdad on a military transport with 47 other people, and the particular feeling of someone walking through a door they cannot walk back through. I was assigned to a brigade legal team, which meant I spent my days in a repurposed building that smelled like diesel and concrete dust, reviewing detainee cases, documenting incidents, trying to apply a framework built for peacetime to circumstances that were anything but. I saw things that year I don't talk about at dinner tables. Not because they were secret, because most people don't have the reference points to receive them. You can describe the physical facts of a thing, the temperature, the sounds, the specific quality of light at 0500 in a forward operating base, and people will nod and imagine something. But what they imagine is not the thing itself, and after a while you stop trying to close that gap and you just carry it in the place where you keep the things that belong only to you. What I will say is this: I learned what courage actually looks like. Not the movie version, the jaw set, the dramatic moment, the single heroic act. Real courage is mostly quiet and mostly unglamorous. It is a young soldier, 20 years old, who has witnessed something wrong, who comes forward to report it, knowing that his chain of command does not want to hear it. It is walking into a general's tent with a case file and a finding that is going to create problems for people with far more rank than you, and making the argument anyway, clearly and without apology, because the argument is correct. I did that 4 times. I won 3 of them. The one I didn't win, I still think about. I think about the soldier whose case it was, a staff sergeant from Louisiana named Marcus Webb. I think about the morning the ruling came down, and I had to explain to him that the system had failed him in a specific and documentable way, and there was nothing further I could do. I think about how he looked at me, not with anger, with something that was almost relief, like even in losing, having someone fight clearly and without apology had given him something he needed. Marcus came to find me 2 years later at a different base in a different country. He'd been reassigned. He'd made sergeant first class. He shook my hand and said, simply, "You're the only lawyer I ever met who I actually believed. That is the closest thing I have to a decoration that matters to me." Afghanistan was different, longer, more complicated. The legal landscape of a counterinsurgency is not a landscape at all. It is a terrain that shifts under your feet daily, where the rules change depending on which command authority is in the room, and what the current political priorities are, and whether the journalist who filed that report last week is still in country. I spent 4 years in and out of Afghanistan between 2007 and 2014. 4 rotations, each one harder than the last, not because of the danger. Danger becomes routine in ways that should probably alarm people, but mostly doesn't. But because of the accumulating weight of complexity. It was during my 3rd rotation that my father died. August. Hot even by Afghanistan standards. I was in Bagram, preparing a case that had been building for 8 months, a serious incident involving contractor misconduct that several people up the chain wanted quietly resolved. I had 48 hours before the proceeding began. My Army email received the forwarded obituary at 0623 on a Tuesday. I read it 3 times. Thomas Cox, 71, of Clarksville, Tennessee, passed peacefully at home. He is survived by his wife, Sandra Cox, and her children, Derek, Melissa, and Ryan. A private service will be held for family. I was not mentioned. I was his only biological child, 22 years in the United States Army. And I was not mentioned. I sat outside that conference room for 11 minutes, and I made my face neutral, and I walked in and I did my job. Because that is what you do. Not because the feelings aren't there. They are always there. But the mission does not pause for them, and neither do you. I won that case. The contractor was prosecuted. It took another 4 months after I rotated home, and 2 other attorneys finished what I started, but it was won. I have never once thought that outcome and what it cost me were a fair trade, but I made the trade anyway, because that is what the job asks of you, and for 22 years, I answered when it asked. People over 60 understand something that younger people are still learning. The life you build through discipline and sacrifice does not announce itself. It does not walk into rooms ahead of you wearing its credentials. It is simply there in the way you carry yourself, in the decisions you make when no one is watching, in the cases you take when the easier choice would be to step aside. My father understood that. He was not always able to stand up for it while he was living, but he found a way to stand up for it from where he was, and I was beginning to understand. Sitting in that conference room in Clarksville with Hargrove's letter still hanging in the air, that he had been planning this for longer than any of us knew. The DNA report was 11 pages long. Hargrove had printed it in full, which was unusual. Most attorneys in estate proceedings summarize, reference, attach as exhibit. Hargrove had printed every page and was going to read the relevant sections into the record, which told me something about how he had prepared for this. He had anticipated resistance. He had decided to leave no interpretive space. That is what a good attorney does when they know the other side that is going to fight. He began with the methodology. Certified laboratory, Nashville, accredited under federal guidelines. Samples collected under supervised chain of custody. 2 samples from Thomas Cox, 1 blood, 1 saliva, collected during a voluntary visit to the lab on June 3rd of the previous year, 10 weeks before his death. The samples from Derek, Melissa, and Ryan had been obtained without their knowledge, which is legal in Tennessee for the purpose of establishing paternity, through items collected from the family home, a coffee cup, a hairbrush, by a third party authorized in writing by Thomas Cox. That third party was Walter Pruitt. I looked across the room at Walter when Hargrove said that. He was sitting very still, hands folded, looking at the table in front of him, not performing humility, simply being present in the way of people who have done a hard thing they believed in and are now waiting for the consequences to settle. My father had asked a 77-year-old veteran to collect DNA samples from his own house without his family knowing. I thought about what that must have cost him. The planning of it, the asking, the trust required to give that assignment to someone and believe it would be carried out correctly and kept quiet. My father was not a strategic man by nature. He was a man of accommodation and quiet generosity, not a man of maneuver. But at the end, with the clock running and the truth at stake, he had become something different. He had become someone who planned. Hargrove read the findings, probability of paternity, Thomas Allen Cox to Kylie Ann Cox, 99.97%. No probability of paternity was identified between Thomas Allen Cox and Derek James Sutton. No probability of paternity was identified between Thomas Allen Cox and Melissa Ann Sutton. No probability of paternity was identified between Thomas Allen Cox and Ryan Patrick Sutton. Each lines landed separately. Not like a verdict, like a series of small doors closing. Ryan, the youngest, who I barely knew, made a sound that was almost a laugh. The stunned, involuntary sound of someone whose brain has defaulted to an inappropriate response because all the appropriate ones are temporarily unavailable. He was 34. He had grown up in that house believing Thomas Cox was his father. Whatever complicated feelings I had about Sandra and Derek and the machinery of what had been done to me, I could not look at Ryan without understanding that he was also a person to whom something had been done, not by me, not by my father, exactly, by Sandra. And by the arithmetic of choices she had made before any of us were in the picture, Sandra still had not spoken. She was looking at the DNA report as Hargrove read from it, and her face had the quality of someone watching a structure they built collapse from a distance. Not surprised, exactly, because they always knew at some level it was possible, but still unable to fully process the reality of watching it go. I had spent 30 years being angry at this woman. Sitting in that room, watching her face, I felt the anger shift into something that had less energy to it. Not forgiveness. I am not built for easy forgiveness, and I do not trust people who are. But something like the recognition of a human being at the end of a long road of bad decisions, which is a different thing from the monster I had constructed in the architecture of my memory. She was still responsible. That did not change. But she was also just a woman in a chair, watching the thing she had built come apart. Derek was not at that stage. Derek was still in the fighting stage, which I had anticipated. He said, his voice controlled and cold in a way that told me the control was costing him something. This doesn't change anything legally. Dad raised us. For 30 years he raised us. Biological paternity is one factor in a testamentary proceeding, not the only factor. Intent matters. History matters. The relationship matters. We can challenge this. He was talking to Hargrove, but he was watching me. I said nothing. Hargrove said, "Mr. Sutton Cox," Derek said. Automatic. Sharp, a small silence. Hargrove said, evenly, "The legal name on the birth certificate is Sutton. As established by the documentation, your stepfather's will references. You are of course free to use whatever name you prefer personally." He paused. As I was saying, the amended will does address the question of intent directly. Thomas Cox was aware that he had raised children who were not biologically his. He addresses this explicitly. "May I continue?" Derek said nothing. Hargrove continued. My father's words again, through Hargrove's careful reading. "I have provided for Sandra in a separate trust, sufficient for her care and living expenses for the remainder of her life. I have left personal items of sentimental value to Derek, Melissa, and Ryan, itemized in Appendix C. I want them to know that I loved them as children in my house, and I wish them well. What I was not able to give them, and what I should have given them years ago, was the truth about who they were. That failure is mine. I am sorry for it. Then, the remainder of my estate, real property, liquid assets, and all holdings not otherwise designated, I leave in full to my daughter, my only biological child. The one I failed most consistently, and who deserved better than what I gave her. I hope this is a beginning of something, even though I won't be there to see it. Kylie." I'm sorry it took me this long. Hargrove folded the page. The room was silent in the way. Rooms are silent when the thing that needed to be said has finally been said and there is nothing left to do but absorb it. I looked at the table in front of me. I thought about a man in his 70s, sick and running out of time, sitting down to write those words, knowing he would never see what they did. Choosing the truth at the end because he had not chosen it enough in the middle. I thought, it is enough. It is not everything, but it is enough. And underneath that thought, very quiet, very old, I knew he loved me. I always knew. I just needed once to hear it said out loud in a room where someone else could witness it. Now I had that. Whatever happened next, I had that. Derek moved fast for a man who had just had the floor taken out from under him. Within 30 seconds of Hargrove folding that page, Derek had his phone out and was typing. Not speaking, typing. The specific focused typing of a man contacting someone he had on retainer for exactly this kind of emergency. I watched him do it without comment. I had expected it. I would have been surprised if he hadn't. Hargrove waited. He was good at waiting. A quality I respected professionally, the ability to allow a room to run through its immediate reaction without feeding it, without trying to manage it too early. You wait until the first wave breaks, and then you speak into the space that follows. He said, I want to note for the record that the documents submitted today have been reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys retained by this office for exactly this proceeding. The chain of custody for the DNA report is complete and documented. The military notarization on the amended will has been verified through official JAG channels. Any challenge to these documents will require clear and convincing evidence of fraud or procedural error, the threshold for which is significant under Tennessee law. Derek looked up from his phone. I'm aware of the threshold. I'm sure you are, Hargrove said. Mild. Bottomless. I'm also aware, Derek said, that a document submitted through back channels, assembled by a man in his late 70s, acting on the instructions of someone who was, by all accounts, significantly ill in his final months, is going to face serious scrutiny regarding undue influence and capacity. He had clearly spoken to someone. The language had shifted, less personal, more procedural. The language of a man who has just been told what arguments to make. I let him finish. Then I said, Thomas Cox was examined by 2 independent physicians in the 6 months before his death, both of whom documented full cognitive capacity. Those examinations are referenced in the will and the reports are filed as Exhibit D. I paused. The undue influence argument fails on the facts, because the party alleging influence would need to demonstrate that someone exercised control over my father's decisions. The only person documented to have had that kind of access and influence over him in his final years was your mother, which means that argument points in a direction you probably don't want it to point. Silence. Derek stared at me. I kept my voice level. Not cold, level. There is a difference. Cold is a weapon. Level is simply the maintenance of a standard. I have 22 years of courtroom experience, I said. I have litigated cases in military courts, federal courts, and international tribunals. I have won cases that senior officers told me were unwinnable. I am not telling you this to intimidate you. I am telling you so that you can make an informed decision about how you want to proceed. I looked at him steadily. You have every legal right to contest this. That process will take approximately 18 to 24 months. Will cost both parties significant legal fees, will involve depositions from everyone in this room, including your mother, and will very likely result in the same outcome, because the documents are clean and the evidence is clear. I paused, or we can let Hargrove finish reading. Derek's jaw was tight. The tendons in his neck were visible. He was a man who had operated for 52 years on the assumption that his position in any room was a given. That the inheritance of his name and his mother's marriage had conferred on him a permanent standing that did not need to be argued for because it had never been seriously questioned. I had questioned it, not with anger, not with the accumulated heat of 30 years of being dismissed and diminished and told I had no place. I had questioned it with documentation and precedent and the specific cold clarity of someone who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how to stand in rooms like this one. It was Melissa who broke first. She said, Derek. Her voice was stripped down. The sharpness was gone. Derek, stop. He turned to look at her. Stop, she said again. Just stop. Something passed between them. The specific communication of siblings who have been in the same story for a long time and can speak in the shorthand of shared history. I watched it happen. I could not read all of it, but I could read enough. She knew. Maybe not everything, maybe not all the details of what Sandra had done. The intercepted letters, the DNA, the will, but she knew the shape of it. She had always known the shape of it, and she had made the choice, year after year, to not look directly at it. That is its own kind of complicity. I did not say that out loud. It was true, and it was hers to reckon with, and she was already reckoning with it in the only way available to her right now, which was sitting in a chair in a law office in Clarksville, not quite able to look at anyone directly. Ryan hadn't spoken since the DNA results were read. He was sitting back from the table now, slightly removed, the body language of a person who has mentally exited a room they are still physically in. He was 34 years old, and he had just been told that the name he'd grown up with did not belong to him in the way he thought. That is not a small thing to absorb in real time. I had no quarrel with Ryan. I was not sure I ever had. Sandra spoke, the first words she had said since the reading began. She said quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the table, or perhaps to my father through whatever medium the words of the living reached the dead. He told me he didn't care. He said it didn't matter. I looked at her. She was not speaking to me. But she was speaking about something real. I could hear that. Not a justification, not a defense, but a piece of history being turned over. Something Thomas had said to her, once, that she had used to build a story she could live inside. He didn't care. It didn't matter. He had said that, probably. Because that was Thomas, the man who kept the peace by telling people what they needed to hear and then writing the truth in letters he hoped would arrive safely. He had cared. He had always cared. He had just been afraid, for a very long time, and then, at the end, he had decided to stop being afraid. I said, to Sandra not unkindly, he cared. He just didn't know how to show it in the time he had. I paused. That's why we're here. She looked at me then. For the first time, directly, without calculation, without the managed expression she had been maintaining since I walked in. She looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. Hargrove looked around the room. At Derek, who had his phone in his hand and was no longer typing. At Melissa, who was looking at the table. At Ryan, who was somewhere else entirely. He said quietly, "Shall I continue?" Derek put his phone down. He said nothing, which was, from Derek, the closest thing to yes. Hargrove had just turned to the final section of the amended will when the door opened. Not dramatically. Not with force. It opened the way doors open when someone has been waiting outside for a long time and has finally been given a signal. Quietly, deliberately, with the economy of movement of people who do not waste motion, 3 men came in. The first was in his mid-60s, heavy-set, with the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform and could not entirely leave it behind even in civilian clothes. He wore a button-down shirt and khakis, and he moved through the door and to the side in one practiced motion, making room for the others. The second was younger. Late 50s, lean, with a prosthetic left arm below the elbow that he carried with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has long since stopped thinking about it. The third was older, 80 perhaps, small and compact, wearing a VFW cap like Walter's, and he walked with a cane, but he walked straight. They stood along the wall, not at the table. They had not been invited to the table, and they did not presume the invitation. They simply stood the way soldiers stand. Present, still, available. Derek said, "What is this?" Walter Pruitt spoke for the first time since he had entered the room. His voice was slower than I remembered, rougher at the edges, but it carried the way voices carry when they have learned through long practice how to reach the back of a room without straining. He said, "These are men who knew Thomas Cox, men he served alongside, or who served alongside his daughter. Men who asked to be here today because Thomas asked them, before he passed, to bear witness if it came to this." Derek looked at Hargrove. "This is a private legal proceeding. You can't just," Hargrove said. "Mr. Cox invited Mr. Pruitt as a witness. Mr. Pruitt's presence and the presence of those accompanying him was specified in a letter filed with this office. They have standing to observe." The older man with the cane looked at me from across the room. He had the eyes of someone who has seen a great deal and has decided to be at peace with most of it. He nodded once. The small, sufficient nod of someone who has traveled a distance to do a thing and is satisfied to find the thing still standing. I nodded back. Walter settled forward in his chair. He had been waiting for this moment. I understood now. The whole morning had been a long patience for Walter, sitting against the wall, watching, waiting for the point at which his voice was needed. He said, "I'd like to say something, if the room will permit it." Hargrove said, "Please," Walter said. I knew Thomas Cox for 40 years. We weren't the same kind of veterans. Different wars, different branches. But we recognized each other the way veterans do. You don't need to explain certain things to people who've been through certain things. He paused. Thomas talked about Kylie. Not to everyone. To me because I asked, because I could see it was something he carried. He was proud of her in a way that had nowhere to go. He couldn't put it out in the open because his house didn't allow it. So he carried it quietly, the way he carried most things. The room was still. Walter continued. About 2 years before he passed, Thomas came to me with something. He'd gotten a letter, a real letter, handwritten, from a commanding officer of Kylie's, colonel she'd worked under in Afghanistan. The letter described a case Kylie had prosecuted, a serious one, the kind where doing the right thing put her career at risk. She did it anyway. Walter's voice was steady, deliberate. Thomas read me that letter out loud, sitting at my kitchen table. He read the whole thing, and when he was done, he folded it up and put it in his breast pocket, and he said, "She got that from her mother. Her mother was the bravest person I ever knew." A pause. Walter looked at me. "I thought you should hear that, in a room." Out loud, I looked back at him and I did not trust my voice, so I said nothing. The man with the prosthetic arm cleared his throat. He said, "I served with Lieutenant Colonel Cox at Bagram. 3rd rotation, 2011. She was JAG, but she ran toward the hard cases, not away from them. I watched her stand in front of a full colonel and tell him his subordinate had committed a crime, and it was going to be prosecuted regardless of what it cost her career." He paused. "It cost her a promotion. She never mentioned it." He did not say this with drama. He said it the way soldiers report facts, directly, without decoration, because the facts are sufficient. The older man with the cane spoke last. His voice was thin but precise. He said, "I'm 81 years old, and I don't travel much anymore. Thomas Cox called me 8 months before he died and asked me personally to come to this if it happened. He said, 'There's going to be a room, and in that room people are going to try to tell my daughter she doesn't belong. I need someone in that room who can tell her she does.' He looked at me, direct and clear. 'You belong,' he said. 'Your father knew it. The people who served with you know it. And now everybody in this room knows it.'" Melissa made a sound, small, compressed. The sound of someone trying to contain something that will not be contained. She put her face in her hands, not performing, not managing. Just done. The specific collapse of someone who has been holding a position for a very long time and has finally run out of the energy required to hold it. Ryan reached over and put his hand on her shoulder. A small gesture, automatic. Whatever complicated truth had just landed on him about his own paternity, his instinct was still to reach for his sister. That meant something, I thought. About who he was underneath the family he'd been raised in. Derek had not moved. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the space in front of him. The phone was face down. He was not typing, not calculating, preparing the next argument. He was simply sitting with the fact that the room had turned, not against him exactly, but away from the story he had been telling, toward a different story, one that had been true all along and was simply now visible. I did not look at him with satisfaction. I looked at him with something closer to sorrow. Not for what he had done to me, that reckoning was his to conduct privately, in his own time, and I had no interest in managing it for him, but for what he had missed. 30 years of looking at his stepfather's biological daughter and seeing a threat instead of a person. 30 years of energy spent on diminishment that could have been spent on something else, That is a particular kind of waste that no inheritance can compensate for. Hargrove set down his final page. He looked around the room, at the men standing along the wall, at Melissa with her face in her hands, at Ryan's hand on her shoulder, at Derek staring at the table, at Sandra sitting in her chair with the stillness of someone at the end of something long, at Walter, who nodded once at me. He said quietly, "The estate of Thomas Allen Cox is hereby distributed as specified in the amended testamentary document, executed June 14th, witnessed and notarized under military seal, and verified by independent counsel." He closed the folder. "The matter is concluded." The room held its breath. Then, very slowly, it let it go. The weeks after that room were not clean. Nothing real ever is. People want the resolution to arrive in a single moment. The gavel comes down, the document is signed, the truth is spoken out loud, and then everyone goes home changed. That is not how human beings work. We are slow creatures when it comes to the things that matter most. We circle. We resist. We sleep on things and wake up still not ready. We take 3 steps towards something and then stand still for a week. I know this because I did it too. The first thing that happened was practical. Hargrove's office began the transfer process, which in the case of real property and multiple accounts is not a fast thing. There were forms, filings, notifications, the specific administrative machinery of moving significant assets from one name to another. I hired a local attorney, not Hargrove, who had served my father well but whose role was concluded. A woman named Patricia Okafor, who had a reputation in Clarksville for being difficult to rattle. She handled the process with a precision that I appreciated professionally and was grateful for personally because it meant I did not have to be in rooms with Derek's attorneys on a daily basis. Derek did not contest. I had told him in that conference room that a challenge would take 18 to 24 months and would likely end in the same place. I had told him this not as a threat but as information, and he had apparently processed it as information, because within 10 days of the reading, his attorney sent a letter to Okafor's office indicating that Derek Sutton, the name used in the letter, which I noted without comment, did not intend to pursue formal contestation of the amended will. I do not know what that decision cost him internally. I did not ask. It was not mine to know. What I did know was that Melissa called me. 12 days after the reading, a Tuesday evening, I was back at Fort Bragg, sitting in my quarters with a cup of tea going cold on the desk beside me. My phone buzzed, and I looked at the screen, and her name was there, Melissa Cox, which was the name I still had for her in my contacts from some prior exchange years ago, some logistical communication I could no longer remember the specifics of. I looked at the name for a long moment, then I answered. She said, "I don't know why I'm calling." I said, "Okay." A silence. She said, "I knew. I want you to know that I knew. Not everything. I didn't know about the letters, not specifically, not that Mom was intercepting them, but I knew the shape of it. I knew Dad felt guilty about you, and I let myself believe that was just him being sentimental about a kid from his first marriage. And I didn't ask questions because I didn't want the answers." Her voice was careful, controlled in the way of someone who has been rehearsing this and is still not sure they can get through it. "That's not the same as doing what Mom did." "But it's not nothing either," I said. "No, it's not nothing." Another silence. Longer. She said, "I'm sorry, Kylie." I sat with that for a moment. The word sorry is a small container for a large thing, and most of the time it is inadequate to the situation it is offered for. This was one of those times. Melissa's sorry could not return the 30 years, could not give me back the dinners I wasn't at, the holidays that happened without me, the phone call that did not come when my father died. But it was also real. I could hear that it was real. Not managed, not strategic, just a woman on the phone at 9 in the evening saying the truest thing she had available. I said, "I hear you, not I forgive you, not it's okay." Because it was not okay, and forgiveness is not a thing I could produce on demand, not honestly, not yet, but I heard her. And hearing her was something. She said quietly, "He talked about you, you know. Dad." Not to Derek, Derek wouldn't, but to me, sometimes, when it was just us. He'd get a letter from you, and he'd fold it up and put it in his shirt pocket, and he'd have this expression for the rest of the day." She paused. "I used to think it was sadness. Now I think it was something else. Like he was carrying something good that he couldn't share." I closed my eyes. I thought about my father walking around a house in Tennessee with one of my letters in his shirt pocket, close to his chest for a whole day. I said, "Thank you for telling me that." She said, "Okay," a pause. "Okay," we said goodbye. We did not make plans to speak again. That was honest, and I think we both knew it. Whatever this conversation was, it was not the beginning of a relationship. Not yet, maybe not ever. It was a clearing of something. A settling of accounts between two people who had been in the same story for 30 years without ever being in the same room for it. That was enough for now. Ryan sent a letter. Actual paper, handwritten, which surprised me. He was young enough that the choice of medium felt deliberate. He wrote that he didn't know what to say, except that he was sorry and that none of what happened was something he would have chosen, and that he hoped someday, when things had settled, maybe we could talk. He signed it Ryan Sutton, which was also deliberate. I wrote back, short. I said I appreciated the letter and I wished him well, and I hoped he was okay. I meant all of it. Sandra did not contact me. I did not contact her. There is nothing in the agreement that required it, and nothing in me that was ready for it, and I suspect nothing in her that was ready either. That door is not closed, but it is not open. It exists in the particular state of things that have not yet been decided, which is its own kind of honest. 3 weeks after the reading, I drove back to Clarksville. Not for legal reasons. Not for any official purpose. I drove back because the farmhouse on Route 7 was mine now, and I had not been inside it since I was 18 years old, and I thought it was time. I went on a Thursday afternoon, after the last of the legal formalities had cleared. Okafor had given me the keys the week before, an ordinary keychain, a brass house key, and a smaller one for the outbuilding. Nothing remarkable, and I had carried them in my jacket pocket for 7 days before I was ready to use them. The house was smaller than I remembered. They always are. The thing you carry in memory for 30 years has a different scale than the actual object. The oak tree in the front yard was enormous now. The one I had climbed as a child. It had grown into something my childhood self would have found impossible. All that height, all that permanence. I stood in the front yard for a while. I thought about my father in this house. I thought about the letters. I thought about a man carrying something good close to his chest because he didn't know how to set it down in front of anyone else. Then I unlocked the door. I walked into the house my father had lived in, and for the first time in 29 years, I was home. A year later, I planted something in the front yard, a rose bush. Red? Because my father had always kept a rose bush along the fence line when I was small. I have a memory of him in the early morning, coffee in hand, standing at the fence just looking at it, not doing anything, just looking. And the one that had been there was long gone by the time I walked back through that door. So I bought a new one at a nursery outside of town, and I planted it myself on a Saturday morning in October, 1 year almost to the week after Hargrove read my father's words out loud in that conference room. It sounds small. It is small. But the small things are how you know you've actually arrived somewhere. I retired from the Army 8 months after the reading, 22 years and 4 months. Lieutenant Colonel, JAG Corps, United States Army. I walked out of Fort Bragg on a Friday afternoon with the flag they give you folded in a triangle, a handshake from a brigadier general who said things that were genuinely kind, and the specific feeling of a person who has completed a chapter so long they had started to think it was the whole book. It was not the whole book. I moved back to Clarksville. Not because anyone expected me to, not because it was the practical choice. Fort Bragg was comfortable, familiar, full of people who knew me in the way you know colleagues after 2 decades. Clarksville was complicated and layered and full of the particular kind of weight that places carry when they hold your history in them. I moved back because the house needed someone in it, and because I was tired of living in places that didn't have roots, and because at 48 years old I had finally learned, it only took 3 decades, that running from a thing is not the same as being free of it. I opened a practice, private legal work, mostly estate and family law. Occasionally veterans benefits cases, because those come to me naturally, and because the need is real and significant in ways that most people who haven't looked at the system closely don't understand. Patricia Okafor referred several clients to me in the first month, which was generous and practical in equal measure. I am building something that is mine, in a place that is mine, at a pace that I set. That is new. It is good. Walter Pruitt comes for coffee on Wednesday mornings. That started naturally, without either of us suggesting it. I think I brought something over to his house once, early on, to thank him, and somehow the visit became a standing thing. He is 80 now and slower but entirely himself. We talk about my father sometimes, and sometimes we talk about other things, and sometimes we sit quietly on the porch and watch the road, and that is sufficient. He told me once, on one of those mornings, how my call sign came about Elliger. I had always thought I knew. The obvious reading, the one people assumed, that I kept accounts, that I remembered everything and nothing escaped the ledger. That was not wrong, but it was not the whole of it. Walter said my father had told him the story. One of the men I served with in my first rotation, older than me, a logistics sergeant with 20 years in, had given me the name after watching me work a case that the command structure wanted buried. He had watched me build the file, piece by piece, document by document, over 4 months, in the specific patient way of someone who understands that the truth does not always arrive quickly, but it does arrive if you keep the record correctly. Afterward, he had said, "She doesn't miss anything, not one line. Call her ledger." But Walter said my father's version of the story had a different emphasis. He said Thomas had heard it as, "She keeps the honest account, not the convenient one, not the one that makes everyone comfortable. The one that is actually true." A ledger, kept honestly, is a record of what things actually cost, not what you hoped they would cost, not what it would be convenient for them to have cost, what they actually cost. I had spent 22 years keeping that record, in courtrooms in Kabul and Baghdad and Bagram and Fort Hood and a dozen other places, in the precise documented findings of cases that powerful people wanted closed. In the letters I wrote my father on paper, telling him the truth of my life because he was the one person I trusted to hold it. He had held it, all of it, in his breast pocket close to his chest for 22 years. And at the end, when he could not hold it anymore, he had given it to a room full of people and asked them to witness it. That is what a ledger is for, finally, not just the keeping, the witnessing. The moment when the record is opened and read, and the truth of what things cost is spoken out loud where it cannot be taken back. Older Americans understand something about this. People who have lived long enough to watch things come around. You do not always get to see the ledger opened in your lifetime. Sometimes you spend decades knowing the true account and watching the false one operate in its place, and you learn to carry that knowing without letting it hollow you out. That is its own kind of discipline, its own kind of courage, but sometimes, not always, not often enough, but sometimes, the room happens. The document arrives through the channel no one thought to block. The old man stands up and salutes. The truth is read out loud, and the ledger is balanced. Not because the past is erased. It is not. The years I lost, the calls that didn't come, the chair at the table that was never offered, those things happened and they are part of the record. But the record is now complete, both sides of it. The cost and the acknowledgement of the cost, and the father who found his courage at the end and aimed it in the right direction. I think about him most mornings. Briefly, the way you think about people who are woven into you, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with something that is simply their presence, continued in the particular way of the people we carry forward. I stand at the window, sometimes with my coffee, looking at the rosebush along the fence line. I think about a man standing at that same fence, years ago, early in the morning, looking at the red flowers and not needing to say anything about them. I think I got that from him. The patience, the quiet. The willingness to tend something that takes a long time to bloom and doesn't announce itself. I got that from him. And I am. After 48 years, after 22 years of service, after one October morning in a conference room in Clarksville, Tennessee, I am glad to be here, in this house, with this name, in this life that is entirely, finally mine. If this story found you today, if something in it touched something you've been carrying, I'd like to know. Leave a comment. Tell me where you are and what it brought up for you. Stories like this one don't belong to the person who tells them. They belong to everyone who needed to hear them. Thank you for listening.